we now have our keynote speaker, the Executive Director, World Bank India, Mr. Junaid Ahmad, to kindly speak a few words. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again. Truly, truly thank you for honoring us with your humble presence, sir.
Namaskar and good morning to all of you. I must say, Nick sets a very high standard and challenge of what needs to be said to an audience like this. I'm not sure where to begin, but as disruption happens suddenly, let's begin and see whether I can say something disruptive. I think first we have to look at India where it is today. There are very few people who would have thought that the India that we know would be achieving growth rates of 6, 7, 7.5%. There are very few that would have predicted that poverty rates would come down in India to the extent that it has. There are very few that would have predicted that in India today, 45 million women are organized in self-help groups that have access to $25 billion from commercial markets. And we're talking about women at the lowest income possibility. Now, when you go to a place like Jharkhand and Odisha, and you begin to talk to some of these women, they tell you that they are borrowing money to invest in the education of their children. Right? We're talking about the lowest income scale. These are revolutions in any metric that you want to take. There are very few people who would have said that India would achieve a GST reform that it has achieved. In fact, there is absolutely no case of a nation as big as this coming together, a federal nation, and actually coming together and creating a GST program and taking forward that GST program. Yes, we know that the administration of the GST implementation has been difficult. We know that the debates and issues around whether there should be 4 slabs, 5 slabs, or 1 slab in terms of the tax rate, whether the highest rate is too high. These are almost technical issues that are dwarfed by the historic achievement of creating one market. And that one market is an extremely important discussion today, because that one market, if it indeed becomes one market, will lead to movements of good and people inside India that has potential of shifting India's growth rate from 7.5% to the aspiration of 9% and above. Something that would not have happened if this attempt at creating a one market had not been taken forward. These are huge changes in the measurement of any nation. And when a nation as big as this, a federal nation on top of it, you have to pause for a second and realize that even as Nick talks about the future change, the change that India has gone through is quite an extraordinary change itself. You know, I'm reminded that the average size of a country in the world is something like 31 million people. The average size of a state in India is 39 million people. The largest subnational democracy is in India, UP. Right? Size of Brazil, if not more. And I tell my colleagues at the World Bank that if we were to deliver to Brazil the type of projects we delivered to UP, we'd be thrown out of Brazil. Meaning, we, the World Bank, have to figure out how to work with UP not as a province or a state of a nation. We have to consider it as the largest subnational democracy and completely change the way of engaging in a subnational system. Right? That is the demand India puts on the world. That is the demand that India puts on itself. This is a nation that in 1947, which faced partition, and I'm one of the beneficiaries of the partition, I'm from Bangladesh. It is a nation that worried about partition, but since 1947 to today, it has strengthened itself as a nation. It has grown in terms of an economy, and today the world wants a part of India. They want to be in this market. Nick talks about urbanization. What is fascinating is in the next decade plus, we're going to see the emergence of 400 to 500 million people in cities of different tiers. If you're looking for a consumer market, this is the consumer market, right? This is the challenge that India presents to the world. Now, in that context of what is clearly a dynamic story of South Asia, which is the rise of India, and we just finished a major report, the India Growth Report, in which we did something. We took a 50-year look at the growth rates of India. You know, there's a lot of discussion today, you know, has India lost its place as the fastest growing country in the world because it went from 7+ to 6.5? Is this the downward trends? These are all analysis of a year or two in a framework. So we decided to take a much longer look. We said, let's take a 50-year look at India's growth rate and see what does it tell us. Fascinating. One, India's growth rate has been increasing steadily, right? An acceleration which has been steady. It went from a 3 to 4% growth rate to now it's in the 6 to 7%. Steadily over the decades it has been growing, number one. Number two, the variability around the mean has fallen. That means it's a stable growth. Three, it's a growth that is diversified. China led a lot of its growth through exports. And today it's trying to figure out how to lead its growth through internal consumption to create a balanced framework. India's growth is quite balanced between exports, consumption, and investment. And that's extremely important for a country that aspires to move towards the middle income. Right? In addition, what we discovered, the fourth point, is that it's a resilient growth. Why is it a resilient growth? Well, you know that there's been a lot of discussion that demonetization and the implementation of the GST has put a dampener in several quarters of its growth. It did, but it's back on its path. And our numbers show that by next year, India will again hit the 7.5%. Now, in a nation like this, demonetization, implementation of GST are big shocks. And the fact that it is now able to climb back up tells you that this growth is resilient. I can assure you that if you look up any of the literature a decade ago, it would not have argued that India's growth rate was a steady acceleration, that it was a stable growth, that it was a diversified growth, that it's a resilient growth. Right? This is actually historic. Right? What we also recognize in India is the following, that there was a period when India looked inwards and India's growth mattered only to itself. Today, India's growth looks outward, and therefore it matters to the world. Nick talked about climate change. If India does not change its energy framework of its growth, the world has no chance of achieving climate change management. Today, India has made a challenge for itself that it'll move into 175 gigawatts of renewable energy. If it succeeds in doing that, the world succeeds in its fight on climate change. Two, a lot of commitments have been made about sustainable development goals worldwide. If India does not deliver on education, if it doesn't deliver on health, if it doesn't deliver on water to its communities, the world will not deliver. So India today is a global player, and India's development path is a global development path. And that's a huge change in the history of where India stands. Let's go even further. We in the World Bank are moving towards an aspiration that by 2030, the world will see the fight against extreme poverty to have been won. That's something we could not have dreamt of a generation back. But it can only be won if India sustains its growth path and continues to bring people out of poverty. And it's doing that. Right? And that, again, is another example of India's impact. Now, I say all of this because I think it's very important that the world recognizes that the change that is happening in this nation is a change that the world needs to own and be a shareholder in. And what Nick's presentation does is it actually presents the story that why the rest of the world needs to be interested in India. But it also raises the question or a challenge that if India has made such tectonic shifts in today's changing world of technology, it has to make another tectonic shift, right? And that is quite a challenge for any nation, and it's certainly a challenge for a nation of 1.2, 1.3 billion people. But that's exactly what Nick's presentation is suggesting. You may have recently seen that in the last 3 years, India has risen in the ranks of ease of doing business, which is a index that the World Bank measures. It went from being 142 to now being 100 in its ranking in the world. This shift of about 40 plus is something that we have not seen other nations do. That's quite a dramatic shift. But it has now set itself under the Honorable Prime Minister's aspiration to go from 100 to 50. So it, in fact, is paralleling and taking on the challenge that Nick is saying, that the future lies about even more changes. And in that context, I think just want to reflect on a few thoughts. First is, as I listened to Nick's presentation, it occurred to me that a lot of the discussion has been about the disruptive technology and what it does to service delivery. What we have not done enough is to understand how technology leads to disruptive policy making. The whole story of how nations do policy making, I think, will have to be rethought because of the disruptions in technology. So, for example, we now look at electricity utilities and we say these utilities have to become corporatized, these utilities have to be taken to the market. Fair enough. But if technology is such that electricity delivery can become decentralized and modular, then the whole public policy of managing power access completely changes. Right? How do you get policy makers at the top level, administrative policy, middle level, to actually understand how to take policy making into account when there is such disruptive technology? And I think India needs to invest in that. And so, Nick, as I hear you talk about your master's program and center of excellence in the university level, I think the challenge is that universities have to invest in a new breed of skill development in public policy. And I don't see that happening yet, right? And that's a very serious issue. I believe that Indian universities and Indian schools of centers of excellence that are emerging may well form such a partnership with US schools, for example, in thinking about the next generation of policy making. And it's something that I think that the private sector, all of you who represent the private sector, need to invest in, because ultimately, private sector thrives when there is an enabling state. And in a world of technological shifts, You want that state to also be changing. But if you want that state to be changing, one has to invest in the capacity of the state. And I think that there is a big role in the way the education centers are looking at public policy thinking to reshape it in a way that will meet today's needs. And I say that this is a role that I would look to the private sector to encourage, that you invest in university systems that are able to deliver that kind of skills development, because ultimately an enabling state means an enabling private sector. I think that's one arena of shift that I think needs to happen. The second arena of shift that I would like to suggest is very important is how do you get countries to not think of bankable projects, but bankable institutions. Let me explain. So Mumbai, one of the world's metropolises, one of the world's mega cities, huge movement of people where they live to where the jobs are. And Mumbai has been investing in suburban railway lines to connect the north into the city, etc. But what's interesting is that usually with the private sector, it's always looking at one more project to do, one more line to open, right? Whether it's a suburban line or whether it's a metro line, one more line to open to get mobility to happen. I would argue that in a world that we live in today, that project by project approach to solving development issues is long gone. What Mumbai needs is a very efficient, sustainable, and India's first commuter railway company. Right? Once you create an institution, a company, which actually can respond to market signals, that raises its money in the markets, and it can be a public sector company, that's not the issue, one in which it gives shares to its workers, you then create an agile institution capable of responding to the type of technological changes that are happening. If you don't have institutions that have that capacity, then technological change will pass you by, and that you will not have shifted your institutions into the hands of that technology. So India's ports, India's airports, India's railway, India's water utilities, India's electricity utilities, the next challenge is to move from creating good investment opportunities to actually creating bankable institutions in which you can bring in not only private finance, pension funds and institutional resources, but you create an incentive at an institutional level to be agile and constantly be agile, so that as the world of technology changes, that institution has an incentive to actually adopt that technology. We have here representatives of the Port of LA, and I can assure you that if the Port of LA was run like a public sector administration, it would not be the global class port that it is today. It is a global class port because it is held accountable for the delivery of the port services. Its leaders are held accountable for delivering. They're not held accountable project by project, they're actually held accountable for running a port. And I'm sure that if you looked at the history of the Port of LA 30 years ago and Port of LA today is an entirely different port. Not because government puts money into it, not because government runs it like a civil service, it's because the port has to run like a port. Right? It's a fundamental issue of creating institution. So the 2 points that I would put, or the 3 points that I would put to complement, I hope, Nix's presentation is, one, do not underestimate India. Where it is today from where it was 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, on any radar screen, on any metric, is tectonic shifts, tectonic change. And for a nation of the size of India, that's quite amazing. And I can tell you, for a Bangladeshi to praise India, that takes something to doing also, right? Especially since we lost the last cricket match. The second point that I want to make is that in the next round of shift, India has to focus on creating bankable institutions. Without bankable institutions, it will not be possible for India to lift its game from a 7.5% growth rate to about 9% plus that it needs. And the third point that I'd like to emphasize is technology change has been the source of growth of our planet. Today, there are more people out of poverty. There are more people living longer lives. There are more people whose health is better because of technology. But for technology of the future to be harnessed and captured for even further empowerment of humanity, of giving greater welfare of people, public policy making must change. And how public policy is done must also change. And this is a challenge that I think I would put to the education centers of the world to figure out how, in the future, we deliver public policy training, how we deliver skills development in public management. And I believe that that's an area that Indian universities may well become global leads. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you the best in this important conference, though we've not talked about logistics per se, supply chain per se. I'm glad we haven't, because it's important to put logistics and supply chain in a much bigger story, and to actually say that it is this industry that in fact will be a backbone of this future growth of India. But the future growth of India and the challenges it faces is something that those of you who are involved in the logistics and supply chain industry must understand. So while the rest of the day will truly look at supply chain and look at logistics industry as a whole, I think the beginning must be the way Nick has put it. It must be in a context of a globalized system, a system that is being disrupted by technology, and my point that it must be one where public policy itself must change to that disruption. Thank you very much.
Very kind of you. Thank you very much for concluding in 3 points. So we request you to kindly hold on. We'd like to felicitate you. And ladies and gentlemen, we just have 2 questions. Anyone for a question? Just 2 questions. Ma'am, I'm so sorry. We'll just do the question bit first. Yes, sir. So you may go ahead. The mic, please. Yes, it's there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So really nice to hear you, sir. It was a great knowledge sharing from you. My question, like you discussed about the tectonic changes in India, and you also took the points like GST and ease of doing business, which India has offered, and it has leaped almost like 30 odd points, 30 odd ranks in that. So from a eye of World Bank, or maybe from your personal experience and your personal eye, what can be like the next big tectonic change which India should go? One, maybe you can take a low-hanging fruit, which can be a tectonic change which India should undergo, to do the leaps and bounds. And one, maybe the strategic or aspirational tectonic change which you see from the eye of World Bank, that I want to understand.
You know, you're going to be disappointed by my answer. You never ask an economist to predict, because an economist will never predict, because economists know that markets are far more powerful than the predictions we give, number one. Number two, most of us who have been brought up in the context of what I call neoclassical economics, we always worry about choosing winners or pinpointing winners. What we are more interested in, how do you create public policy and institutions that can thrive as change happens? So instead of answering the question, which is the technology or the low-hanging technology that will really shift the game, my answer would be, regardless of that technological choice, I would like to see what is the low-hanging shifts in institutions that can actually make best use as technology changes. And there I would argue that India should really look at moving the game on its electricity distribution companies, its water companies, its transport companies. That these 3 elements of infrastructure can make change the nature of how these institutions that guide these 3 sectors work. you'll be able to deal with the technological shifts that are coming. So it's a slightly different way of answering your question.
Thank you, sir.
So can I have a small question from here, sir? Excuse me. Excuse me.
Okay, go ahead, please.
I'm Pramod Shah, practicing company secretary and corporate advisors. Sir, you touched to various facets of Indian economy and some of the positive factors also. So I would like to have your comments on the lot of scams happening and also the corruption level not coming down. You can suggest some measures or the preventive things which could be imbibed by the government, sir.
Could you repeat? You want me to give a few examples of?
No, lot of scams happening, which you must have read in the
Strengths.
paper. Scams, you know.
Scams,
Yeah.
sorry.
And the level of the corruption, which is still not coming down despite the government efforts. So would you
The
suggest some?
corruption is not coming down.
Yeah.
And, you know, corruption is not coming down, though the government is trying very hard.
Yeah.
No,
Would you suggest some measures or the preventive measures? Would you suggest
right.
something?
So I think the issue, you know, I think a lot of us are focused on the recent banking crisis, banking scam that happened. Well, let me first say that one scam doesn't make a systemic story. So I think it's important, while that scam is always important for us to take a look at whether the regulatory supervision functions in the banking sector is as efficient as it should. I wouldn't look at one scam as indicative of a system. So I want to make that my first point. Second is, if you look at India, it's using the whole advance of technology in terms of service delivery in dealing with the issues of leakages and corruption. So today, the whole approach to linking financial inclusion, unique ID, and direct transfers to citizens has been extremely important in trying to deal with issues of leakages. So technology, I think, is going to play a big role in dealing with that issue. But having said that, what is also very important is that you have systems and institutions that are transparent. One of the challenges, for example, India has, is if you look at service delivery of water, urban water, you find that the policymaker, the regulator, the service provider are all one, like it's government. So in effect, judge and jury are the same. But if you turn around and say policymaking belongs to the state, regulatory body is an independent agency, and a service provider is a corporatized third party. If you can create separation of powers, you create the type of transparency in service delivery that's important. India has made a lot of changes in the way service delivery happens. So you've seen a lot of positive impact on transparency, accountability, and I think there's more that will happen in the future. But technology there can play a big role. Business today will find that the way business is done today versus the way it was done 30 years ago, a lot has changed. And I believe in the coming decade, a lot more will be changed, especially given that India is in the business of attracting FDI, which it is doing.
Wonderful. That's very kind of you. Thank you so much, sir. We'd like to honor you, sir, with a memento and a bouquet. To do the honors, can I please have once again Mr. Raj Dice on stage along with Mr. Augustine? Can we please request you to be with us here on stage to present a bouquet and a lovely memento to Mr. Junaid Ahmad. Mr. Augustine, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to warm up our palms. Yes, we're going to have a coffee break right after this. So can I please request each and every one of you in the house to put your hands together. It's the great exercise for our individualistic health as well, and it sounds very good. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank Mr. Junaid Ahmad, and Mr. Augustine and Mr. Raj for doing the honors. And to join them, can I please request Mr. Nick Vyas for a photo op, since sir has to leave, and all our respected dignitaries to be here for the photo op, since Mr. Junaid shall be leaving. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a 15-minute, I repeat, mere 15-minute coffee networking break. I request you all to quickly come back for a great panel discussion on how GST is transforming the Indian landscape, GST and SCM, maximizing gains with technology as an enabler. I request you all to be back in your seats in the next 15 minutes. So we're getting back to school days. When the bell rings, I shall give you a reminder in the next 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen on stage. Thank you, ma'am, for doing the honors. Thank you.